Hello and welcome to the second episode of the RinkMasters Podcast featuring Bob Simmonds of the Prince George Cougars. My name is Noah and with me is Tyler. We will be your hosts today. This week we are incredibly honored to have Bob Simmonds join us on the podcast. Thank you for joining us, Bob.
Well, Noah, it's my pleasure to be with you. I was saying earlier, and was interested in the Prince George Cougars I have time for, and I listened to your first episode. I know I have a tough act to follow. Your first guest, Dan Hamhughes, did a great job, as did you fellas.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And before we really get started, Bob, do you want to quickly tell us a bit about yourself?
Well, I like to keep my hair a little longer than shorter, as you can tell, but with the COVID situation, haven't been able to get into a barber anytime recently, but been around the game of hockey my whole life, played junior, coached, been involved in all levels of the game, and now I'm the director of scouting for the Prince George Cougars. I've been with the Cougars, I think 14, 15 years. I'm the longest tenured employee with the Cougars right at the moment. I arrived the year before Chico did. And, but a longtime member of the RCMP. I was in the RCMP for 35, 36 years, retired. And now I get to watch a lot of hockey, which is a lot of fun. People that know me know I really like classic rock and roll. I'm a die-hard Rough Rider fan and Edmonton Oilers season ticket holder. So, but first and foremost, the Cougars are my team. And I love to talk about the Prince George Cougars.
Awesome. Yeah, I know for myself, I'm a Prince George boy, born and raised, and I mean, ever since I was a little kid, all my baby photos, I'm holding up a mini stick. So I know for myself, growing up around the game, I've played and I've watched. My parents and grandparents actually had seasons tickets to the Cougars. So that's where my love of the Cougars started. As I've gotten older, one of the particular interests that I have had in hockey is scouting. I've always wanted to know, when you watch players, you see certain players that end up going quite far in their careers. And you see some players where they don't quite necessarily get to their goal. They kind of develop the same, but then they kind of hit a wall. And so I've always just been interested in what are the attributes and the skills that help a player succeed and to grow. So that's where I'm at.
Well, it's Tyler. That's a very important part of the development of players is what gets a kid or a young man to the next level. And, lots of people love to play the game of hockey, but not a lot of people want to be a hockey player. And there is a distinct difference. And to be a hockey player, you have to be willing to train, to prepare, to live your life the right way, honestly, to get to the next level. And as you know, everything's like a pyramid, and the higher you go, the more narrow it becomes until you get to the apex. And you hope when you're watching players, and all the kids we watch can skate well. A lot of them got skill. A lot of them process the game, but you need to know what's in that inner core, what lights their fire, what makes them want to succeed. And quite frankly, when you talk to parents and you talk to coaches and you talk to opposing players and teachers, you want to get a complete picture. And hopefully when it's all said and done, you have an idea of those traits that are not obvious, but that person is going to put the time and effort and diligence into to succeeding, because you need that to succeed in this game. Like I say, everybody starts at the same point once they come into, as an example, the Western Hockey League. But you can tell players that have trained the right way in summer. You get to training camp, and you can tell a player who's put the effort in over the course of the summer and that they're ready to go and they'll do anything to succeed. And hopefully you bring more than less of those type of players into your organization. And if you do, you have a good chance to be successful.
That's great. You kind of mentioned it a little bit, but this year the Cougars drafted more than 4 players who have had a letter on their jersey, right? And we're just wondering how you determine the character and leadership abilities of a player outside of just the letter.
Well, good question. And obviously, when you're watching them play the game, for one thing, you're watching body language. You're watching, their consistency of effort. You're watching how they engage the referees. You're watching how they engage their teammates. You're watching how they communicate to the coach on the bench. Then when the game is over, you're talking to people. And when you get closer to the draft, when you start having some meaningful discussions with people, you talk to opposing players, you talk to teammates, you talk to teachers, you talk to other parents, and you find out an awful lot about the character of a player. Now, obviously, when you see a young man wearing a letter, you kind of assume, okay, the coaches, and typically speaking at 14 and 15, 16 and midget and whatnot, the coaches are the ones that select who the captains are, and you automatically, or you make an assumption perhaps that, this young man's got leadership qualities and whatnot. But, there's a lot more to it than just wearing a letter. It's, about being respectful to the game, about being a fierce competitor, and, and there's many different ways to lead. And hopefully when it's all said and done, and you're looking to bring a young man into your organization, that those types of attributes you've identified and they check off the boxes, and there you go.
And so within taking those, it's almost like a CSI investigation and trying to see the character of a player, right? So when you go to the Bantam draft, there's a whole huge list of players available. So when you're scouting, does the time spent scouting drastically affect who you pick at the draft? And do you get a chance to see everybody, or is it just part, a fraction of the players available that you guys really get a good read on?
Well, we have a very capable and competent scouting staff, and we have coverage in all 4 provinces that the league has jurisdiction over. We have a scout in the United States, but beyond that, myself specifically, I get down to the States. So we see, as an example, this most recent draft year, the 05s, we saw hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of players. And in order to see that, you see thousands of hockey games, from the staff across the board. Myself personally, I see north of 600 games every year. And this year, a lot of that was obviously the 05 Bantams. And, so I would like to think that we get to see most of the players that are eligible for that particular draft year. And, I don't think we miss many. Although, to be honest with you, we do focus on the AAA leagues and the prep leagues, and sometimes there are some communities that have AA programs that perhaps those players kind of fall through the cracks a bit. But then you hope that you see them at the provincial camps, and so you don't miss them. But number of times seeing a player, you want to have a complete a picture as possible on a player. You want to paint a portrait if possible, so that person as a player, as a person off the ice, as best possible. So obviously, you want to get a good picture. You want to see progression from the start of the year to the end of the year. You want to look for plateaus. You want to look for regressions. And, if a young fellow has started the year at a level and then ends the season at a level higher, I think, you're good. Can you see a player too often? Yeah, perhaps you can, because sometimes if you see a player almost too much, to be honest with you, sometimes then you start picking and you start focusing on the bad habits as opposed to what the good habits are. And, nobody's perfect. Everybody's got elements to work on. But you want to have a good picture, and obviously you have to be in the rink, and And like I say, I think that the 10 players we drafted this year and the 2 that, if you count the U.S. draft, so we brought 12 05s into the organization, each and every one of them can play in our league, 100%. So, this year we had a really good scouting year this year.
Yeah. So, within the organization, how do the scouts get, I guess, distributed throughout the different provinces? Are they assigned by you to different areas, or is that from higher up that you're told where to put certain people?
Well, I manage the scouting program, and we have scouts in Manitoba, we have scouts in Saskatchewan, we have scouts in Alberta, and we have scouts in British Columbia, and we have a scout in Arizona. Now, these fellows that are in those areas, they know that they need to know their province inside and out, top to bottom. And you don't really need to tell these guys where to go and what to do. They know their business. Within our scouting staff, we do have a couple of what I would describe senior traveling guys, so they get out to a lot of tournaments. I will assign certain assignments for them to do, certain tournaments that they have to travel to, but we encourage our, there's some priority tournaments. The John Reed in St. Albert is kind of like the Rose Bowl of Bantam tournaments. The Rocky Mountain Classic in Calgary, the provincial camps at the end of the year, although this year that didn't happen. The CSSHL championships in Penticton. But we bring most of our scouts into those events. The ownership of the Prince George Cougars provides us the wherewithal to succeed. So we want to make sure that we have a complete picture of who's who from Manitoba to British Columbia, and who's who south of the border as well.
As speaking of the those tournaments, I know I was looking at the like Riley Height, Caden Brown, and Riker Singer at that tournament, the John Brink tournament there. I think that's what it's called. Sorry, they did really well there. It seems. Does that have any impact on the draft? Like, if players start performing really well at those tournaments, do they jump higher, or do they kind of stay where they were ranked before?
Well, certainly those premier events can have impact, because typically speaking, those tournaments have the elite teams, and it's easy to feast on a team. I've seen some Bantam teams, they don't win a game, and they're getting beat 10-2, 11-3, that kind of thing, and so you want to see some of these kids, how they perform against elite teams in meaningful games. So those scouting events certainly can have some impact on a final ranking or a projection for sure. You want to see a player compete against the best, how well they do against the best, and that's from an individual and a team basis for sure.
Yeah, so you kind of brought up the draft a little bit. Going into the draft, are there players that you're pretty certain you're going to be able to draft, or do you have a list of players that you'd be happy to have every year? And then along that lines, have there ever been any players that you really thought you'd get and you were really looking forward to get for them to be drafted by another team?
Well, the first thing you have to understand and get used to is you will never get 100% of the players that you want. And, so having said that, in a very basic way, I will have, or we will have as the Prince George Cougars scouting team, a master list of 225 players, as an example. That you believe are, merit draft consideration. And, we break our draft down into components, an A, B, or a C, and an A is, 1 to 3 rounds, B is 4 to 6, and C is, round 7 and later. But within that master list, I will have another side list of players that are a priority to us. And I have, the belief that we're going to try and get, or the plan is to try and get as many of those players as possible. And you have them projected into certain areas. Riley Heidt, as an example, you mentioned his name. That was a no-brainer, to pick him at 2 overall. Riley is a game changer. He's an elite level player, and that was a no-brainer, that pick. Now, obviously, Caden Brown, where we took him, that's where we had him projected. We hoped he was going to be available for us, and again, Caden has the intangible, if you will, of being very connected to Northern British Columbia. He's a Fort St. John boy. Dad played for the Prince George Cougars back in the 90s, and strong connections to the community of Prince George. So, but not only that, I mean, he's an elite level player, and we knew he would be an excellent complement to Riley Heidt as you look forward, and again, Singer. So we have, but you got to have a flexibility too, because a team can go off the map and suddenly the draft changes because a player that you don't think is going to be there is there. And honestly, I didn't think Riker Singer would be there at 22 in the first round. And when he was there, I mean, you had to take him. I mean, he was that good. And did that change our strategy a bit? Perhaps it did, but it certainly was to our benefit. So you have a game plan and you want to stick to it as much as possible, but you also have to be flexible enough to react to some unanticipated things that happen. So
I'm really glad you touched in on Riker Singer there, because he's a player that I had going relatively within the top 15. And I guess this draft is also very deep. So a lot of players definitely could have went higher than they did. And it definitely shuffled around quite a bit on draft day. But another player I was really intrigued to see fall to you guys in the second round was Bauerdumansky. He was a defenseman that I thought could have been a first round defenseman. He's probably one of my favorite defensemen in the draft. Were you surprised to see him fall to you guys in the second round?
Well, it's funny, and you kind of have to have a bit of intuition too, as when you start to see which players are being picked. So, this year, as an example, we knew we were taking Riley Heidt, and fingers crossed that Caden Brown was going to be there at 17. So it was kind of 2 forwards, and then. In my head, perhaps you were thinking, okay, 2 forwards, then you want to go a defenseman. Honestly, with Gauthier and Brennan in net, we knew we weren't going to be taking a goalie that high. So, you're maybe thinking 2 forwards and a defenseman, that will be your first round. But then when Riker Singer is there, and Tyler, as you say, he's a tremendous player. He's going to be unbelievable for the Prince George Cougars, as is Brown and Heidt and all the prospects from the 04s and the other 05s and some of these 03s. So then you start to think, okay, I think we need Riker Singer is that good that we need to take him here. So then you start to think, okay, which defensemen are left though? And, I knew obviously our first pick in the second round was going to be very, very early. And, you have to cross your fingers a bit and a bit of a gamble. But I figured at that point that Bauerdumansky would be available at our next pick. And so then suddenly it's like, okay, Bauer would be a defenseman that's very capable of being a first round pick. But I think he's going to be there at 26. So, to take Riker Singer and knowing and feeling very confident that Dumansky, simply because I have a pretty good idea of what the next teams are going to do between Singer and Dumansky, I think we'll be able to get him. So it was a no-brainer, for us to get those 4 players in the order that we did. And now, they're also going to start at the same starting point. when training camp starts, and you know, they're all going to have huge roles with the Prince George Cougars looking ahead, without a doubt.
You mentioned how Riley Height is an exceptional player, right? And how you were very sure that you get him at the second overall pick. What is it that makes him so good? Like, what was it that got him up to that second pick?
Well, I mean, you know, there were say 5 crown jewels in this recent draft. Obviously, Connor Bedard. I don't think anybody thought that he was going to go anyplace other than first overall. Then you had, you know, Riley Height. You had Braden Yager. You had Cole Lind or Caden Lind, and then you had Tanner Molendijk. You know, those 5 players are all game changers. And so when the draft lottery unfolded the way it unfolded, you know, suddenly we had the good fortune of being in the second overall position, and honestly, you knew Bedard was gone. So really, the draft started there, and so you know the comparison started to become Yager Height, you know, Height Yager, and you know, for us, and you know, and I read all the pundits going into the draft, and Yager wouldn't come to Prince George, and that's why they had to take Height, and it wasn't that at all. So we had the opportunity to watch those 2 young men, and they're both exceptional players. Braden Yager is an unbelievable hockey player. Mm-hmm. We watched the 2 of them at Martinsville last year as underage players, and we watched them at length this year as underage and midget, and different players. But Riley Height, for us, made the players around him better. He was, you know, an elite level thinker of the game as well. Very creative, very intuitive player. Do anything to win, and you know, his hockey IQ, you know, when you combine it with his obviously character, you know, willingness to be the best that he can be, but to have everybody around them to be around him to be the best they can be. So it was a very, very easy pick for us, to be honest with you. And you know, obviously, you know, we feel that, you know, we got the best player, you know, next to Connor Bedard. And could have we taken Braden Yager? Yes, we could have. Lynn Mullen. We had our option, and we weren't forced into taking anybody. We took who we believed was the best player for the Prince George Cougars.
Yeah, I'm really glad you cleared that up too, because I've heard many different as well, like on Twitter, and I have a couple of friends that live in Saskatchewan, so they had different people telling them different things. And so, yeah, like I heard one, like the week before the draft, I heard, oh yeah, Yager would be willing to go to Prince George. Same with Height, like they're all willing. And then like the next week it was like, oh, actually Yager doesn't want to go, so they're going to take Height. And I'm like, I don't know. I didn't quite. It's really like, you got to take it with a grain of salt, right? And I think it's good because I know like Prince George for a while, that's kind of been the stigma, right? Like there's always rumors going around that certain players don't want to come here, and it's just, I don't know, it can be pretty, I don't know, it gives us, like, I think Prince George a bit of a bad light, so it's good that we kind of clear that up there.
Well,
right?
Well, yeah, the issue of recruitment, you know, historically, when you go back in time, there have been periods of time when getting players to Prince George has been a bit of a challenge. There's no doubt about that. And some drafts, you know, when you look back in time, the impact of players really not wanting to come to Prince George, you know, was definitely a factor. But this year, and certainly from the 03, the 04, and the 05 drafts, you know, these kids all want to play with each other. You know, we signed our first 4 picks immediately in the 05 group. I would suggest that the 10 players that we picked, they would all sign if we were in a position to offer them agreements right now. These kids know who the elite level players are. They all want to play with each other. But, you know, as far as Prince George goes, we have a coaching staff that's second to none We have skills development people, you know, with Steve O'Rourke. Our facility, the CN Center, is unbelievable. These kids want to be in Prince George. And, you know, so this year, as an example, picking 2 overall, was that selection impacted by anybody not wanting to come to Prince George? Not in the least.
Yes.
Yeah. I know for me, I've been wondering in the last 2 seasons about like if the picks that the Cougars have made, as they've made more high-level picks, if that has then encouraged more players that, oh yeah, Prince George is a program that I'd want to play in. So like I was wondering, especially this year, after we had a good number of high picks in I think it was the 04 draft, with Zemer and Dauhaniak, right? If that actually had an impact on players wanting to come to Prince George more this year.
Absolutely. You know, players want to play with players that they know they're going to succeed with. And elite level players want to play with elite level players. And, you know, obviously success builds upon itself. And some of these players that have committed, yes, that has an impact. Absolutely. The fact that Riley Height is now committed to us, that's going to have a positive impact, you know, next year and beyond. And as I say, you know, with social media and most of these elite level teams traveling around, they compete against each other, and they know who's who in the zoo, and these kids want to play with each other. Absolutely.
And so the WHL this year had their inaugural U.S. draft. What are your thoughts on the draft, and how do you think the Cougars fared with their picks?
Well, I think it's an excellent idea. You know, the league itself showcased itself very, very well to a lot of U.S.-based players and their families who really had limited exposure to our league. And I thought it was, you know, I think it accomplished its goals in showcasing the league to some of these U.S. players, and obviously presenting the Western Hockey League as a very viable option for them. As far as the 2 players that we picked specifically, you know, the goalie from Dallas, Dylan Johnson, he can play. He stops pucks. He gives his team a chance to win every game. He keeps his team close. Zephyr Tangri, the defenseman from Los Angeles, he's 6'3", 6'4" already. He's got a stick, his gap control. He's a player. He can play as well. I am very happy with the 2 players we picked, and you know, now we just need to get them up to Prince George. Obviously, with this COVID-19 and the uncertainty as to when training camp was going to be, you know, there could be some challenges to get them up to Prince George. But I believe our program will sell itself to these 2 young men. And do I anticipate or expect the 2 of them will be future Prince George Cougars? Yes, I do.
You kind of brought up bringing the players from the U.S. up to Prince George, and that brings up a question that I had about the import draft. Is there ever an element of wanting to choose a player that you have a much better idea will come to Prince George or come to North America after that draft? Because I know from conversations I've heard and from like the news and stuff, like it seems like there's usually a lot of apprehension around whether or not a player will actually come to North America or whether or not they'll stay and play in Europe until the NHL entry draft.
Well, the issue of will a player come to North America, and well, look at this. Our meeting's been upgraded.
Perfect.
Look at that. We have unlimited minutes. The issue of will a player come? Yeah, that's certainly important. You know, and that's part of the process. But obviously, with your European import players, you know, you want to bring as much skill into the organization as possible. And in this particular case, with Joni Karkkainen, you know, but he made it very clear he wants to come to the Canadian Hockey League. He wants to come to Canada. He certainly wants to come to Prince George. So you want to make sure that you have as much certainty as possible. And yeah, so that's certainly an impactful factor when considering a player, but again, are there circumstances where a player could be so good that you would have to take him and then recruit the heck out of him? Perhaps, but obviously, if we're going to expend a very valuable draft resource on a player from Europe, we want to make sure as best possible that we know they're going to come. Absolutely, Noah.
And I also had another question kind of on the import draft. How extensively do you get to scout those players, or is it more just other footage that you receive, or do you actually ever have a scout that like actually travels to go see them?
Traveling to Europe, I'd love to be able to travel to Europe to scout hockey players. But that hasn't happened and likely won't. So the import draft for, I imagine, most organizations is sort of relationship based with agents and scouts that are over. So we get lots of referrals from agents, from coaches, from NHL scouts, from people who you know in the hockey world and hockey community. And so once you gather a slate of names, if you will, via those processes and through those types of relationships, then you set about to watching video and making phone calls to, people that are over there. So, well, I guess it's safe to say we do get scouting reports, but a lot of these sources of scouting reports from Europe are from people that aren't, I guess, officially Prince George Cougar scouts, but are, function as a scout and certainly provide us the information and intelligence that we need. And as well, I watch hours and hours and hours of video of some of these potential drafts, as does Mark as well.
Yeah, it's really cool to just know how that works, because with European players, for us, we don't really know a whole lot about them. You look through the draft sheet and you're just trying to pick apart these names. And I know when I first saw Karkainen, I was like, oh, all right, let's go check on his hockey profile. And then you just can't quite find a whole lot. So I'd assume that Mark Lamb's pro connections plays a really big part in his success with imports. Because I know going back to Swift Current, like with Eetu Laatikainen, Julius Honka, Alexei Heponiemi, he's had a lot of good success with Finns in particular. So maybe that's something as Prince George Cougars fans we should be really excited about.
I agree. When you look at Mark's history of European players coming to the Western Hockey League, and as you say, Tyler, certainly his success with Finnish players in Swift Current, I think you could say this young man that we've brought into the organization, bodes well for us. Mark's relationship and his standing in the hockey community is almost without peer, and a lot of fellows over in Europe, knowing the success that Mark has had in developing players, and you look at his track record, as you say, in Swift Current, they want for their clients the same situation. So we this year, as an example, we had 4 or 5 very, very high profile players sort of sent our way, if you will, as far as on the radar for us. And the young man that we picked was the player that we ended up having at the top of the list, and we got our guy.
I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but we're about to run out of time here. So is there any other questions, Tyler, that you had or anything?
No, I think we've definitely covered all the questions that came with, and then some. We got a lot of good questions out of all this. With that, we conclude RinkMasters Episode 2, Finding a Champion with Bob Simmonds. Thank you, Bob, for lending us your time and expertise on this podcast. It was a really, this whole conversation, I definitely was a learning experience for us, and hopefully our listeners as well. And we hope to have you on in the future.
Well, it's been my pleasure, and best of luck with the podcast. Anything that can help the Prince George Cougars and certainly the Western Hockey League and hockey in general, it's great. And I wish you guys nothing but the best. And I hope for an opportunity to speak with you again. Absolutely.
Yeah. And thank you to all our fans for your continued support of the podcast. It certainly means a lot. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe to our Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube for the latest updates and exclusive content. Next Tuesday, we will be releasing episode 3 of the RinkMasters Podcast, Developing a Champion. Thank you for listening. We look forward to seeing you again next week.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
See you guys.